Welcome to Everything is Everything. I'm Amit. This is my good friend Ajay, and today we are going to tell you more stories that should have been films.
We've done a show of this nature earlier where we plucked pieces of history where we felt there was really something very interesting going on that could be a movie, that should be a movie, and at worst is a great story that you, gentle reader, shall suffer from us. So here is another episode of that genre. How should we do this, Amit?
We should do this by starting to tell stories. Our last episode was actually a great story on its own called The Reformers. Wonderful episode. We had a lot of fun doing it. That's what I mean by wonderful episode. The experience has to be good. And that was a story that took up a full episode. But today we are going to sort of do five stories, three by you, two by me. So you go first and you end and we alternate in between, forming a nice sort of symmetrical pattern. So your turn.
So I want to tell a story which combines things that blow up and great human drama. Okay, sometimes my stories are just things that blow up, but here there is a very natural, deep human tension inside the story. So here's the setting. In the summer of 1940, Rommel led the German tanks blasting through the Ardennes forest, and France and the French and the British armies lost the Battle of France, and the French government capitulated. They signed the armistice, and they were about to walk out of the war. That left the little question of what was going to happen to the French Navy. Okay? They had ships, they had considerable possessions, and by default, they would fall into German hands. So there was a very real threat that the considerable French naval assets would fall into German hands, and that would enormously bolster the German Navy. It's important to think that in the British way of war, complete naval domination was an essential ingredient. It was the way they did things. They controlled the shipping lanes, and that is an immense capability to bring to the table. So just the way in which today United States and NATO doctrine is, you first achieve air superiority. There is no way they will play a plan for a war without achieving complete air superiority, which, for instance, the Russians did not over Ukraine. But there is no way the Americans will ever go into a war. There's no way that NATO will ever go into a war and not first achieve air superiority, because that's the way they think. It's like a foundation, it's a precondition. In similar fashion, in the British way of war, there was always this notion that the Royal Navy will have a ridiculous level of domination on the seas. So even a German challenge where the Germans were on a shipping build out to some extent and augmented by French equipment could turn into a German challenge. And so for the British, this was a very high priority, that there is no way we want any conflict against the domination of the Royal Navy. So the British started reaching out through informal channels to the French Navy saying, just surrender to us. Like, come over, bring your ships and come over to us. Okay, like remember the First World War? We fought hand in hand. No, more than that. When the Germans invaded in 1940, in the summer of 1940, the British landed an expeditionary force in France to fight alongside the French, okay, and lost. And that took us to the Battle of Dunkirk, the landings, the retreat from Dunkirk, which we talked about as Christopher Nolan's 2017 movie. Okay, it was as strong a partnership as that British Expeditionary Force, 300,000 people and all their equipment had come into France to support the French in their fight. So this is not an unreasonable request for the British to tell the Royal Navy that, look, the Germans have won. There's a reasonable scenario that all this equipment will become German controlled equipment, and none of us want this to happen. And come over to our side, bring your equipment and come over and become a part of the Allies against Germany. And it's curious to go inside the minds of the people in the French Navy. On one hand, there was the so-called Vichy regime led by Marshal Pétain, which was nominally a French government. We may consider it an illegitimate French government, but it would claim to be a French government, which said, no, we are here, we're the French government. And we are giving military orders to the French commanders of ships, saying, you stay put, you are French Navy. You're not going away to the British side. That is one piece of it. Another piece of it is the military culture of obedience. That for many people in the military, there is, in my opinion, an excessive dose of blind obedience. So you're not supposed to think that the Germans have captured France and the Germans control Marshal Pétain, but we will take orders and we will obey. And we're not going to think, we're not going to ask questions. So I think this is part 2. And part 3 is that there has been a certain sense of France, inside France, that they were actually a first-class power, that they were an equal in world affairs. Okay, so again, you have to think of history. In 1914, in the First World War, the British and the Americans fought alongside France and were absolutely central to winning the First World War. There was no way France could have done it alone. But only 100 years ago, Napoleon fought the British, and in the Battle of Trafalgar, the French Navy got destroyed by the British Navy. So there are some of these, delusions in France of being a first-class power, of being an equal to the UK and America, of being a Vishwaguru, of having some novel knowledge and philosophy that they wish to give the world. There has been that streak of concept in France, that France is special, that France is unique. So capitulating and handing over your equipment to the British was perhaps irritating to some. Okay, so this was the little drama that was going on, where the British were reaching out to the commanders of the French Navy saying, come over. And there was a great deal of thinking and debate and divergent views inside the French Navy. And positions started hardening on both sides. And matters came to a head at the Algerian town of Mers el Kebir, where there was a significant contingent of the French Navy. It was a significant force there, and the British just absolutely did not want that force to fall into German hands. So they were acutely pursuing this negotiation, saying, come over to our side. Some on the French side said that we promise that if the Germans try to take over these ships, we will scuttle them. But that's a promise about a future event, and you can't know how these things go wrong. What if they fail to scuttle the ships when the Germans come to grab the ships? So there was this tense and escalating conversation between both sides. And Churchill was having none of this. And Churchill writes that this was just one of the worst decisions that he had to make in the entire war. And the Royal Navy showed up in strength in front of Mers el Kebir. Until the very end, there were desperate pleas going out to the French side saying, surrender, come over to our side. That you belong with the Royal Navy in fighting Nazi Germany. And there would have been all kinds of debate inside the French side on, do we do it, do we not do it, do we do it, do we not do it? And in the end, they refused. And Churchill gave the order, and the Royal Navy opened fire and destroyed the French Navy there, and 1,300 sailors died. So in that one decision, Churchill created the death of 1,300 French soldiers who, really were not Nazi Germany. And I think a lot about all the pieces that took us there to that moment where the French were just intransigent and not willing to see sense. Some historians have written that this was a mistake by Churchill. My reading of history is with Churchill, that The only reasonable solution was for the French Navy to hand over its equipment and people and go to the British side and be with, Charles de Gaulle and the others who built the French resistance and ultimately, won back Free France. But at that moment, whoever were the blokes running this were just intransigent and refused to go over to the British side. And Churchill gave the order, and 1,300 people died.
There are times where you really don't know what kind of judgment to come to. And most stories we should not judge. The world is complex, people are complex. But there are some times where you really don't know. As in terms of, the second of my two stories today has, that element built in that, something may end well. But are the means used to get there moral? And that's a question you have to ask yourself. That at one hand, it's a strong, powerful moral imperative for Britain and the allies to beat Nazi Germany. And in a sense, the direction of civilization itself is at stake.
Yes.
But is this justifiable when it's not just ships you are scuttling, but 1,300 people who are dying? And these are just really difficult questions. And I think in hindsight, to pass any kind of judgment on them is, I think, a little bit of a problem. Sometimes you have to say that there is no clear line that you can draw.
Correct. So hindsight is easy. What's really, really difficult is standing there. What would you do? What would the blokes on the French side do? What would Churchill do? It's very, very difficult to be in those shoes and make these decisions. So for all the great movie makers watching Everything is Everything, I think this is a grand story that combines things that blow up and a deep human drama.
A deep human drama and anecdote for you. Around that time, when the Germany had taken over France, Marshal Pétain was in charge. Nehru and Patel were talking about this. And Patel asked Nehru, because Nehru was better informed in international affairs. So Patel asked Nehru, and I will have to say this in Hindi. Patel asked Nehru that, Jawahar, एक बात बताओ यार कि ये फ्रेंच साइड पे कोई है जो हमें वॉर जिताएगा? What was Nehru's answer?
Do tell.
पता नहीं. I'm so sorry for that. I must also point out to observant general listeners that you might have noticed that in the course of this little exchange that we had, my mic flipped out from inside and came outside. And the reason for that is it was making some interesting noises, at which point Ajay pointed out to Vaishnav and Nomsita, our wonderful cinematographers, that the structural integrity of his kurta is suspect. So I was made to, button up. And I'm like, that is such a military analyst phrase. Structural integrity of the kurta is a phrase which is
Engineering speak.
Yeah, and since it has also been pointed out to me that I did our last storytelling episode in this same kurta. This is my storytelling kurta, and you can henceforth call me what? What can you call me?
Do tell.
Okay, when I was in, I'll give you a hint. Grunge. You can call me Kurta Kuben. Anyway, leaving that aside, no, I loved your story, and the human angle is there because of the French soldiers who died. There are individual stories happening there. There are Churchill's own dilemmas with all the shit that is happening around him, and all of that. So again,
and the backdrop of, what we term that French illusion, that there is something special about France, that they are a Vishwaguru, and they're actually an equal player compared to America and the UK on the global stage, while actually they have just been humiliated and destroyed by the German army and lost a war. The psychological puzzle of being French at that point, of not willing to accept that actually the wise thing to do is to take your people and equipment and go over to the British side, because that's the only hope through which you will ever get back into the continent again.
And it's not just that. There is also, and here I get the sense that while you like to blow things up, and this is a film that requires some kind of scale, especially when the ships are being scuttled and all of that is happening,
no ships are being scuttled. Ships are destroyed by British cannon.
They are destroyed. Oh, I love the enthusiasm and zeal with which you use the word destroyed. And so the thing is that you are arguing for what is really a mainstream Hollywood treatment for a story that is very unlike mainstream Hollywood, because there are no there are no sort of easy conclusions here. There is no victory for anyone. There is a deep moral dilemma and a sense of unease, and nothing is resolved. So interesting idea.
Great, Amit. Tell us your idea for a movie that ought to be made.
Okay, so here's this second story that I came across recently, and that would be a great film. And there's a grand angle to it and an intimate angle to it. And the grand angle is fact, and it's like a factual backdrop, and the intimate angle is pure fiction. So let's kind of get there. And I don't know what to name this, but working title: Silence of the Heart. Are you intrigued by that?
Very much?
Silence of the Heart. So have you heard of ERPI? ERPI.
No.
You haven't heard of ERPI. So in 1926, AT&T set up a department called ERPI, which is Electrical Research Products Incorporated,
Okay.
more or less. It was something like that. And so they set up ERPI in 1926. And the idea was this. Sound cinema had just come in. The Jazz Singer, I think, would be released in a couple of years from there by Al Jolson. And this was a group set up to evangelize sound in theaters. And these were a group of people who believed that sound in theaters should be a particular way. So we are going to set up a group, and they're going to grow not across the country, not across AT&T's markets, but across the world. And they're going to evangelize good sound in theaters. So there would be people from ERPI who would, travel across the world. And, they would have custom knapsacks. They would have a kit. And their enemy everywhere was silence. And the sidekick of the devil was silence, and the sidekick of the devil was reverberation. So they were, taking the religion of clean, pure sound to the world. And they had a knapsack, and I think they had a cap whistle in it. And they would go inside theatrical spaces, and they would, use the cap whistle, and they would listen for reverberations and echoes. And there was like a ton of training that went into this. And there's a great essay on this by Emily Thompson called Wiring the World. We'll link that from the show notes. Just a fascinating recounting of the period. And I first learnt about it in what is really my recommendation of today, which is this marvelous book by David Byrne called How Music Works. And one of the great books on music. And I'll read out this section from it where he talks about these people, where he says, and he's imagining what ERPI was like. And Byrne writes, I can picture a group of uniformed men, head slightly forward, brows furrowed, listening intently, communicating with each other through hand signals in perfect silence. The skills they were developing were, in my opinion, almost mystical, in that they might have been training themselves to be able to hear things the rest of us would miss, or to become aware of sounds that we would hear only subconsciously. Like some acoustic Sherlock Holmes, they could survey a room with their ears and be able to tell you things about it, even what was going on outside of it, things that ordinary mortals without their special powers would miss. Right? And this is, of course, sort of a mystical description of what would happen. But the mundane description is they would look all around, they would hear intently, and then they would go all around, putting padding in places or drapes in other places so that sound would, sound good from wherever you are, and etc., etc. And the way Thompson describes it is that this was not just a technical mission, right? This was cultural, this was moral, this was almost ideological. They went about it with that evangelical zeal that these are our values, this is how something should sound, and we will kind of, change the world with this. We will spread our values everywhere. Sounds familiar? Kind of like that, right? Almost like an American version of Macaulay, or what they've tried to do elsewhere in the world. And there are little funny elements in my film. For example, true story, they were at a theater in Canton, Ohio, and they're all listening intently, and then they're looking at each other kind of puzzled, because there's a sound which is a little bit like a roar, and they can't figure out what is this roar, what is this sound. So they go here and they go there, and they try their cap whistle, and they just can't figure out that there's some gentle roar happening in the distance from where the screen seems to be. But wo speaker se nahi hai, ye speaker se nahi hai, where is it coming from, what's going on? Then they go behind the stage and find that behind the stage there are 6 caged lions, because the circus is also nearby. So they're actually hearing the lions roar, and us side where they're trying to figure out what is this noise, what is this interesting sound effect, what could be doing it, where can we put cushions, etc., etc. So kind of a fascinating story, and they start growing really fast. Like they have 1,000 such screens at the start of 1929. They have 4,000 such screens by the end of 1929. In 1 year, they're just, spreading the word all over. But eventually it fizzles out. The French get pissed off. Like, who the fuck are you to tell us how things should sound? They burn a theater down, which they have done. And then the Indians are, a key player in this great essay by Emily Thompson, Wiring the World. And she talks about how the Indians eventually master sound, and the Indian film industry is the biggest in the world. And they're also like, fuck off, we don't need you. And Urpi eventually goes nowhere. And by the way, they had a newsletter called, you have to guess the name. What was the name of the newsletter by Urpi?
I
Ajay
can't
Shah.
imagine.
It's a slow day for you. Urpigram. Right. So, and a lot of comic elements in this story. And this is a grand story. This is a fact. Now I want to bring fiction to it and a slightly intimate story. Now, Urpi, as they grew bigger, they would boast about the zeal and the 70-hour work weeks, as it were, like not literally 70 hours, but they would boast about how their men have so much, put so much into it that they're creating Urpi widows, as it were, women who are ignored because the men are spreading the religion of sound all over the world. And, but before that, I think they did have women also working for them, but they had started hiring only bachelors so that there would be no Urpi widows. But in my story, it's at the early phase, and there is a couple who are both committed to the Urpi cause. It is like a couple that joins a religious cult together, or that joins a physics lab together, and they're like deeply passionate. So in my little fictional story, there's a couple that joins Urpi, and they're going across the world, and they're equally passionate, and part of their love for each other is a shared passion, right? And at one point, the woman starts hearing things a little differently. So the man is listening to things like the other Urpi people in a similar way. Ki, this is the quality of that sound. This is where we should put some layers of insulation and etc. etc. But she's hearing slightly different things. And at first, as women tend to do, she gaslights herself and says, something must be wrong with me. Something must be wrong with my ears. My man is hearing things a certain way. Everybody seems to agree with him. Something is wrong with me. And then later, as the film goes on, she kind of embraces dad and owns dad and says, no, it's not me. Everybody hears differently. Why is he right? Why am I wrong? This is how I listen. This is how he listens. And there are metaphors all over this, and people do listen differently. Like all four of us in this room now, you, me, Vaishnav and Namsita are cinematographers. We will all hear things differently without being able to articulate it or communicate it to each other. And in this hearing, there is also a metaphor for the ways in which you see the world differently. But sometimes you force yourself to conform to somebody's vision, right? And we have seen much cinema in which two people drift apart because they see the world differently. But imagine two people drifting apart because they hear the world differently. Imagine a scene where you're going back and forth between the two people, and as you do so, the oral landscape changes. You see things from her point of view. She's hearing something differently. Maybe there's some more quiet somewhere. She's hearing something more and something less. And in his case, it's kind of the other way around. And that landscape of sound, as it were, changes both people, the way that they hear.
You would put that in the movie?
I
So, we should discuss with Gaurav Chintamani that there could be one specific filter for one person's landscape and another filter for another person's landscape, something that is perceptible in Dolby Audio.
Exactly, and it's doable. Technology today allows you to do it, and I think I can't think of a film that has been made like that. You have films where people see things differently, different perspectives, but to hear things differently, and then to think about the difference that makes. If I am exposed to a certain piece of news in a certain oral landscape, and the oral landscape has put me in a certain frame of mind, I react differently to how you might if you're hearing things differently. So I just found that it's an interesting idea to explore, and the Urpi setting as a kind of a backdrop to this is a really interesting way to do it, because the macrocosm of ideological zeal and one way of looking at the world coming to a fall can also contain the microcosm of the relationship of these people and this woman stopping to doubt herself
And
and just owning it.
And a nice feminist movie.
Well, I mean, let's not put labels to it. These are human stories. If it happens to be feminist, it happens to be feminist, but that's never the purpose. The purpose is you kind of tell a human story, and I'm just sort of...
Great idea. This is everything, and is the rules of the game that all digressions are welcome?
Of course, go ahead.
What if I told you that there is a damn decent chance of that you, Captain Varma, have the capacity inside your mind today to learn to do echolocation like a bat?
Are you kidding me?
I'm dead serious. Okay, so here are the steps. You take a data set of people who have lost their eyesight after age 5 or something, where you have learned to see and you're fully a part of the world. And then there was an accident and you lost both eyes. So now you're completely blind. Okay, it turns out that with careful effort and training, 2/3 of these individuals are able to orient themselves in physical landscapes with echolocation in the fashion of bats, where they whistle and they listen for the echoes. 66% chance that you are trainable thus. This is the power that resides inside each of us. We are just not aware of it. Like, we think bats echolocate. We don't think that we can echolocate. So what people do is they whistle and they listen for the reflection. Some people are so great at doing this, they're able to ride a bicycle outdoors, not just walk outdoors. They're able to ride a bicycle outdoors and they're echolocating to see other traffic and houses and so on.
It's just mind blowing, and I also love the way you ride a bicycle like this. And I have two data points. I have two data points to bring to this, and one data point is against you, but one data point, the more recent data point, is in support of you.
Okay.
And the data point against you is this great essay by Thomas Nagel, written in the early 1970s, great philosopher, called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And his postulation and a question he poses is that, listen, now, what is echolocation for our gentle readers? I have to kind of point, for those who may not know, I have to point out that bats don't have eyes. They see through sound. So they send off sounds and those come back, and through that they kind of figure out what everything looks like and they navigate the world like that. And Nagel's point was that you can intellectually understand how a bat navigates a world, but you cannot ever really imagine the experience of what it is like to be a bat, right? But as you are pointing out, it can happen. And now here's my second data point. I did this episode of the Krish Ashok. I did this episode of The Seen and the Unseen.
You did this episode with the Krish Ashok.
With the Krish Ashok. I have done 2 episodes with the Krish Ashok. And in the first one, he spoke about listening at higher speeds. I think he listens to my podcast at 3x and so on. And he pointed out how he has a visually impaired colleague, basically blind, who listens to everything at 6x. Now, I tried listening to something at 6x. I can go as far as 3.5 comfortably. After that, it's mush. Though I'm sure I can train myself. But at 6x, it's just a khichdi of sound, right? Can't really make out anything. But see the plasticity of the brain, that a person can lose faculty in one way through their eyes, and the brain will immediately adjust and, get creative about ways of figuring the world out. And it's just marvelous to me.
Yeah.
So, Ajay, what is your second story for the day?
Yeah. My second story starts at the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was in Hawaii, and it was where the United States entered the Second World War and Japan entered the Second World War. Japan thought that they could score a powerful blow right at the inception and destroy a significant chunk of the United States Navy and thus get a head start on fighting their war. And there was great outrage and anger, of course, inside the United States. And there was also a problem that Japan was inaccessibly far away. So how do you strike back at Japan? So remember, the Japanese never got meaningfully to California. They did some trivial things on the American West Coast. There was a genuine rivalry around the Aleutian Islands, which are at the edge of Alaska. But for the rest, Pearl Harbor was a strike against Hawaii, not against the American mainland. But if you're a military planner and you're going to wage a war against Japan, you want to strike at Japan. But Japan was inaccessibly far away. And, in those days, the so-called strategic bombers did not exist. ICBMs did not exist. So how was the United States going to make things difficult for the mainland, the island of Japan, was a question. And there are two parts to this. One is a psychological war and the other is a functional perspective. In a functional perspective, it was thought that you want to destroy the factories and the infrastructure so that it damages the ability of Japan to produce. Japan was an incredibly successful and advanced economy, and they were very, very, very good at production. I think at that time, most people underestimated how great the Japanese were at production. And my sense is only over the coming decades after the war, people fully understood the economic might of Japan. They were a first class economy standing in 1941. So there was a two-part problem, one of disrupting production in Japan and the other of starting to indulge in the psychological warfare, because at the time the Japanese people were in this la-la land. They thought that this is free, that they have the initiative, they've done the first strike, and they would be fed the propaganda that they've knocked out a lot of ships in the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the puzzle posed was, how do you get a first attack back into the Japanese mainland? Okay, and that was at the time considered infeasible using conventional equipment. So a bunch of people got to thinking, and there was a mainstay of the American equipment at the time. It was called the B-25 bomber. Okay, so it's not a great bomber because the war had just begun. The really great design projects happened afterwards. But it had certain capabilities, and you try to do all the calculations and nothing fits. So a bunch of engineers got to work on hacking and adapting the B-25 bomber to make it better. It was going to go into a very cold region. It needed a new level of de-icing equipment. It needed a higher range than it had ever done before. So it needed to be hacked to remove some things and put additional fuel tanks to give an almost 80 or 90% increase in its range, and so on. A whole bunch of things were done to that craft to make it suitable for the plan that I'm going to describe. And I want to tell a meta lesson there, that I think of the world as two levels. One is where we buy equipment and we use them in normal ways. But real excellence and amazing things happen when we hack on the equipment, when we do things with the equipment that nobody had ever dreamed of, when we are modifying the stuff, when we understand enough to take it apart and change it and rebuild it. Okay, I think this is a very important way for all of us, that you can be a dumb user of other people's creations, or you can know enough about them that you're able to take it apart and modify it and adapt it and do something new that had never before been imagined. And I think this is a story of that the B-25 bomber was modified and hacked in 16 different ways to make it suitable for a project. And what was the project? A carrier group set out from the American mainland and sailed towards Japan. And at the furthest possible point, the mission design was that a bunch of planes would take off from the carrier, fly over Japan, bomb industrial and defense sites near Tokyo. Then there was no coming back because there was not enough range, and further, these planes were not the kind that could land on an aircraft carrier. Okay, these were big bombers which at the time could take off from an aircraft carrier but not land on it. So the plan hatched was to go beyond Japan. So then they tried asking the Soviets that, do you think we could come into Vladivostok? Stalin had signed a peace treaty with Japan. So, the relationships between all these guys was more complicated. Today, we think in terms of clear lines of allies and axis. At the time, those lines were not drawn so clearly. Stalin refused. He said, no, I have a peace treaty with Japan. That I'm fighting Hitler on this side. I don't want to make trouble with the Japanese. So he said, I will not host your planes on the other side. So they asked that, would you let these craft come over and land at Vladivostok? And he said, no. So they got an agreement from Chiang Kai-shek, who was then the Kuomintang ruler of mainland China, that these planes will come and land in China, and some airfields were prepared. So that was a mission design. This is called the Doolittle raid for Captain James Doolittle, who was the leader of this raid. Okay, so this whole thing was set into motion, and unfortunately things went wrong because before they had reached the final point where the distance calculations all work out correctly, so that the B-25 will take off from the aircraft carrier, hit targets in Japan, and go on to airfields in China. Before all that could happen, a Japanese naval ship sighted the group. So the carrier group was sighted, and then these guys had to assume that this ship raised an alarm back in Japan. They would have radioed back that I'm seeing a big carrier group here. Okay? And that Japanese ship did indeed desperately send the message back to Japan before being destroyed. But the interesting thing that happened on the Japanese side was a failure of imagination. They thought we are safe because there is no planes which can take off from a carrier and reach Japan. So they hadn't understood that the planes had been hacked. They thought we're fine. Okay, fine. There's a carrier group there. So they thought of it as a naval attack. And so they mobilized to meet this with a naval response. They couldn't imagine that planes can take off from there and hit Japan and end up in China. That imagination of the raid was not available to the Japanese side.
It might have been a fatal sin of someone there that he was navel gazing and not navel gazing.
Yes, he was fighting the last war, so to speak. But on the American side, they thought, oh my God, this jig is up, because they've seen us. And, finally, bombers are slow, fat targets. And if you just mobilize enough of the Japanese Zero was the world's greatest fighter plane in certain senses. If you mobilize enough of a fighter reception party, then this entire raid gets destroyed. So even though they were not quite at the correct place, they just said that this is it, take off. So they immediately told the bombers to take off from the carrier decks and initiate the raid, even though it was in the wrong location. So the planes took off and they managed to hit targets in Japan with reasonable success, but they were all short of their airfield destinations in China. One of the planes had some mechanical trouble and they chose to go land as a distressed bird into Vladivostok. Okay, and the other planes, all of them did something messy. They crash landed, the crews bailed out at various locations in China. Okay, and then there is the incredibly dramatic end of all these stories. Most of the crews were successfully rescued by the Kuomintang in China and found their way back. But after that, the Japanese launched a horrendous reprisal against the Chinese military and civilian population. The Japanese killed something like 70,000 soldiers and 250,000 civilians as a punishment against China for supporting the Americans in this raid. And finally, I talked about one plane that landed in Vladivostok, and much later there was a negotiation with the Russian side, with the Soviet side, saying, like, look guys, you want to get these guys out. So the NKVD organized a fake escape. So these guys were put into internment camp in Central Asia, and then with the collusion of the NKVD, they escaped from the camp and came down into Iran, where they reached a British camp and they got out. So this is the story of all the crews, where some died in the attack, some crash landed in China and got out. And then after that, there was a horrible Japanese campaign to punish the Kuomintang for their support for the Doolittle raid. There was one plane that reached Vladivostok. Now, did the raid work? Okay, so was this a good idea of using all this resource to play psychological warfare? I think historians have judged that the answer is yes, that it did work, that a mere 4 months, let me remember, I think December 1941 was Pearl Harbor, and April 1942 was a Doolittle raid. So for 4 months, Japan felt at peace that, oh yeah, everything is going swimmingly. And a mere 4 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor was the Doolittle raid that everybody in Japan saw and understood. And suddenly it changed the psychological landscape in Japan, that we're not getting away with this cheaply.
Remarkable story, and I love the scale of the story, which is really vast. But you zoom in a little later, so many human stories on the Chinese side, the Japanese side, the decision made on the ship to ask all these pilots to like get the hell
Just
out of
go.
there when
Yeah.
you don't know if they'll come back,
Yeah.
and what's going on through the heads of these people, and yet you go on driven by sort of purpose and duty and all of that. Even though your commander is a guy called Doolittle, like naam dekho bhai ka, kaise motivate karoge?
Yeah.
But they kind of do all of that. So, you can zoom into any part of it and make that your central story and just tell the story at scale. What were your, you've mentioned many times how much you like Dunkirk. Growing up, what are the war films you really like? Because I wasn't into war films, but I remember
Yeah.
vaguely things like The Great Escape and
Yeah.
Bridge on the River
They were
Kwai and all.
okay. I didn't love them that much.
Hmm.
I don't agree. I don't agree that Great Escape is a great movie. I think it's a
Hmm.
really
No,
mediocre movie.
I only remember
Yeah.
watching it
Yeah,
because
yeah. So
I
I
don't
watched
remember
all
how
these
it
standard
was.
movies. I
Hmm.
actually took off into this as an adult.
Hmm.
As a child, I wasn't. And also remember, movies were made really badly in those days.
Hmm.
So there was Soviet propaganda movies where you could see the cardboard tanks being blown up. They were so badly done. So I think war movies really got together as a genre only in the last 20 years when the equipment got better.
What do you think is behind the human um appetite for spectacle? Right? You said you like to see things blow up. I'm not judging you for this. It doesn't mean you're a violent man. You're a very gentle soul. I know of that. But, so many of us like to see things blow up, like to see death and destruction and blah, blah, blah. And especially when
Because
it's how,
it's
what is,
unputdownable. It captures the mind. It captures the
but why
imagination.
is my question? Why do you
That's
think? I
part
mean, why did
one.
we evolve
But
to,
but equally part two is, I feel the Second World War is so compelling because the fate of the world is on the line. The stakes are sky high. Whereas, I mean, you could conceivably establish many of similar scenes on, like, for example, the Falklands War. Okay, there's some stupid conflict between some strongman in Argentina and the Royal Navy. And there are amazing moments where there is a French Exocet missile that blows up a British ship and things like that. But it's not interesting. Nobody will ever want a movie of that. Why? Because the stakes are so low. It's like academic politics. So I think what's compelling about the Second World War or the next story that I'm about to tell you is that the fate of the world is on the line. And then all this comes together that they're life and death decisions for individuals, and they're actually very, very fateful choices for the whole world. And then it all comes together.
I love the way you say the stakes are so low, like academic politics. You just like threw that in there, thinking no one will notice, but
Oh,
I'm going to like highlight it. This
it's
is
a
what he said,
it's supposed
gentlemen.
to be a famous line that
Yeah.
why is academic politics so vicious? And the answer is because the stakes are so low.
Beautifully said. And
Mm.
yeah, but the one, not a disagreement, but a difference in taste is that I think even in the Falklands War, you tell any story, I think the stakes are high because
Yeah, you
human beings
could.
are involved.
But,
So
but
wherever
when the
human,
universe has given you things like the Second World War as the canvas on which to paint, why would you do other things?
fair point.
Very well, Amit. Tell us your next grand idea that you're pitching to a movie maker.
So I mentioned when you spoke about, the dilemma over Churchill's decision that I was going to tell you a story that features a, a similar cognitive dissonance where you don't know how to think about it. And that is when I think about the making of independent India, in the sense that I love this country, right? I'm glad that we are what we are. I'm glad ki, I can go from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, as it were. Kal Bangalore chale gaye, parsu Jaipur chale gaye, etc., etc. Not that I'm traveling this much, but I can do all of these things, the diversity of culture and everything. But I have deep disquiet with how this country was put together right after independence. It's easy to look back and think of the lines on the map as sacrosanct, think of, oh, these are all the states, and but we didn't get the nation like that. We got the nation in a state of great uncertainty, where you had more than 500 princely states. Out of those 500 princely states, 327 princely states, I think, were really small, 20 square miles, and it was just a distributed mess of different states and all of that. And I would say, in some senses, even a delightful mess. What is wrong with multiplicity and diversity and all of that? So that was a state of the country, and in a period of 2 or 3 years, Sardar Patel and the bureaucrat who assisted him, a great man called VP Menon, who reminds me in many ways of your friend KP Krishnan, by the way, this great man VP Menon, along with Sardar Patel, they put together all these princely states and they built the map of what we call India today. And they did it using a variety of means, which included coercion and which included broken promises, right? Promises that were later broken. And when I think about that, I feel this deep disquiet. We have spoken earlier about the means and the end. It is very important to me that we always consider the means as something supremely important. The moment you say that the end justifies the means, then you can make up any end in your head कि ये करेंगे वो करेंगे, and then you can commit the greatest brutality. So if I look at it through that lens, I wonder कि ठीक है यहाँ पहुँच गए. I really like the country that we are in, but I feel uncomfortable about the way that it was kind of put together. I refer to it often as fast track colonization, right? What the British did over 200, 300 years, Sardar Patel and VP Menon did in like a couple of years. And I understand the intent behind the project. I understand the grand thinking. It is not just the discovery of India as Nehru would have put it, but it is also in a sense the sort of the invention, the formation, all of those things. But it is a vision that you're imposing on people who may not necessarily want it, which is so deeply distressing that there are cats screaming in the background because they get the sense of what I am saying. There is some disquiet there that this is where we are, but we got here in this manner. So I want to sort of tell a story with multiple layers. And one layer is of how Sardar Patel and VP Menon put all of this together. But within this, there are other layers. For example, now I will go into images, right? And let sort of the wannabe filmmaker in myself express myself. So in one of these episodes of this series, I certainly see sort of a narrative that is broken up into a number of different chunks, right? And they all come together at the end. And chunk one, right at the start of this episode, is that there is a boy in a school in the early 1900s who is being scolded by his teacher, and then he's finally told that he's being failed in his examination because of bad attendance. And he's trying to explain his circumstances. I have to come so many miles and all that. And the school teacher says, no, I'm expelling you. Not expelling you, I'm failing you in the exam, and tells him to leave class and go home immediately. And home is very far away for this kid. So the kid goes up, he runs out, and he had forgotten his lunchbox. So there is someone who's got the lunchbox for him, and he just grabs the lunchbox from that person and he runs off, and there are tears streaming down his face. And this is scene one. Scene two, which comes a little later in the same episode, is that he's sitting in the railway station, a railway station where he sometimes likes to sit and read and repose. And this little kid is sitting in that railway station holding his lunchbox, still not open. Perhaps in his hands the warmth has turned to cold, but he's still sitting there and he's just shaking and he's crying, and that is a scene. And then later, another scene that comes up is he's gone from the railway station to the riverside, and the riverside is where he finds peace and he can get some peace of mind. And he's just walking there and he's looking at the river, and God knows what is going through this little boy's mind, and that's what's happening. And then there's a fourth scene which comes later where he's sitting under a tree. And in my notes, I wrote this as sitting under a tree. So a typo, which is most unfortunate, but no, it's not that. He's sitting under a tree and he's eating his lunch, and it's probably cold by now, but he's eating the food, but obviously not mindfully. He's very sad. And then there's another scene later, and he's sleeping. He's sleeping under the tree as the light changes. And then there's another scene later, a separate scene, where he wakes up and it's dusk and it's time for him to make the long journey home. And he looks to the side and he finds that there is an empty bottle of alcohol some drunkard has left. And he picks up the bottle and he looks at it, right? And then there is another scene, the penultimate scene of this little dispersed story, the story dispersed across scenes, where he is at a liquor store and he's buying something and he's saying, my mother will pay for it later. And he buys something and it looks like a bottle, so you assume it must be alcohol. But then he turns and says, give me a matchbox also. And the last scene of the film is the school is on fire. This little boy has set the school on fire. Ajay Shah, this is a true story. This is a story of VP Menon. This is a story of VP Menon, who was so upset that he burnt his school and he fled from his village. And he took it, and he just, after this, he goes and he gets on a train, and it's a train to a place called Kolar. And this is a memory of the man that decades later, when he is talking about that journey, these are his words. That train went from Ottapalam to Lakkidi and then Parali and then on to Olavakode. We went through a tunnel at Valayar and then we stopped at Pothanur. Decades later, he remembers the name of every place. He goes to Kolar, and there he works in the mine fields. And very soon, because he is so smart, he's so brilliant with organizing himself that he's giving orders to men who are twice his age. And he figures out a way to deal with these people, just those human skills and all of that. After this, he decides, after a while, that this isn't the life for him. And he goes off to Bombay. And for a while, he's a towel salesman on the streets of Bombay, right? And then somebody, through, serendipitous events, recommends that he go to Delhi. And he goes to Delhi and he gets down at Delhi station to look for a job and he realizes his pocket has been picked. And now he's in Delhi station and there's no money and he's still a young man. And then the Sardarji gentleman walks by and asks him, Kya hua bete? And he says ki this is it, in whatever halting language he must have mustered, because I don't think his Hindi would have been that great since he's just come from the south. And the Sardarji gentleman says, Koi baat nahi bete. And he gives him $10. $10 is nothing in this day and age. 10 rupees in 1916, 1917, whatever the year was, is a huge amount of money, a huge act of generosity. He forgets to ask this man's name, right? And it's a little event. If that little event doesn't happen, India could be in a different place. Little events make a big difference. And then this boy goes on to join the government. He joins the government, he becomes a clerk, he starts rising up the ranks. And then the Rowlatt Act happens in 1919. And he says, fuck, I don't want to work for these bastards. He's against empire. But then at some point, he settles down and decides that sometimes some people have to stay within to change the world. And everybody can't go out and rebel. And he stays within the system. And all of these details, by the way, I got from a marvelous book called V.P. Menon, The Unsung Architect of Modern India by Narayani Basu. She's been on the show with me. And I think she's his granddaughter, if I'm not mistaken. And it's just a great human story that you think of this expressionless bureaucrat who is assisting Siddharth Patel and who's doing all of this. But this is a backdrop. This is an incredible story. A young boy setting his school on fire, right? And he joins Siddharth Patel. And this is also a man with a troubled personal life. He's not good to his family because people are complex. We contain multitudes. He's bad with his wife and children. He's not good to his family. But his work is like a mission to him, right? And Sardar Patel has found just the right man to help him. I mean, my episode on him was titled India's Greatest Civil Servant. And it's a remarkable story. And then Sardar Patel and V.P. Menon then go around trying to get all the princes to sign up. Remember, more than 500 princely states. 327 of them, if I remember the number correctly, are really small. And they want to convince all of them. Now, there is coercion, but as far as possible, you want to use the power of persuasion. You want to use your human skills. And V.P. Menon is the executor. He's a consigliere. He is both the strategist and the man who's on the front lines, kind of getting the job done. There is one, memorable scene which happens, which takes place in Jodhpur, when the king of Jodhpur says, and you will remember that on paper, what these people were told is, you can be with India, you can be with Pakistan, you can be independent. But that simply wasn't true. They could not be independent. And if your territory was within India, there was no way that, Patel and Menon were going to allow you to be in Pakistan, without a contiguous landmass. That just didn't make sense. So they are sort of trying to persuade the king of Jodhpur that, forget about independence and blah, 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 and, just come over to us. And the man in question is a gentleman named Hanwant Singh, who's been described as a fat, rambunctious boy who turned out to be this portly man with a certain amount of stubbornness to him. And he, and his argument to V.P. Menon, and there is this famous meeting where V.P. Menon and Mountbatten are sitting with him and trying to convince him, ki boss, sign this, come over to us, it's fine, we'll be India, we'll be, great nation, we'll be Vishwaguru one day. And he says, no, Jinnah spoke to me. Jinnah offered me a blank check. He said, it's a blank check, you name your figure, but you say that you're with Pakistan and all of that. And eventually they managed to convince him that, hey, please sign. And he's about to sign. And Mountbatten has left the room and V.P. Menon is alone with this gentleman. And the pen he has is also a gun. It's a gun cum pen. It's really funny. So he's just about to sign when he points a gun at V.P. Menon. And V.P. Menon and this is my cinematic imagination, V.P. Menon just raises his eyebrow and then he smiles, and then Hanwant Singh signs. And many years later, and this is like a sometime in the early to mid 50s, Hanwant Singh calls up EP Menon and says, "Hey man, you were a good bureaucrat, but why don't you come and stand for the elections from Jodhpur? You be the MP from here, I'll make you win." And VP Menon, of course, says no. There's a similar story of Junagadh, where the Nawab of Junagadh says that, hey, I want to go, I want Pakistan and all that. And they manage to convince him. And there is some amount of threats and coercion, both the carrot and the stick involved. So at one point, the Nawab of Junagadh realizes that he's got to go. But because he doesn't want to be in India, so he decides I'm gonna go, but I'm not going to leave my riches behind, because after all the kingdom belongs to me, all his wealth belongs to me. So there is a plane that is chartered to take him off. He gets inside the plane, all the money that he has is there, all the jewelry and everything, the treasury of the kingdom, all that is taken inside, all his dogs are taken inside, all his begums are taken inside, all the children are taken inside, and then the plane is about to take off. And then one begum squeaks out, wait, I lost my child is still in the palace, I forgot to get him. Right? So a moment of like his own child, right? Though he has many children and many begums. So he says, I must not forget anything. And he looks around and he counts the dogs, and all the dogs are there. And then he tells the begum, I love you. It was nice knowing you. Please get off. And she gets off, and then the plane takes off and he goes to Karachi. So, and there are so many fantastic stories. If there are like 547 princely states or whatever there are 547 stories. And all through this, there is our man VP Menon, there is Sardar Patel, who's such a great character in his own right. There is, the dynamics between Patel and Nehru, which are so fascinating. And they weren't at loggerheads, as one caricature goes, but nor were they completely together on everything, as another caricature goes. One of the sleeper hits of the Seen and the Unseen is this episode called Nehru's Letters, which I did with Tripurdaman Singh and Adil Hussain on a great book they wrote, where they collated letters of Nehru with various of his sort of political counterparts, and one of them was Patel. And you see the respect they have for each other, but they also, respectfully disagreeing and battling and holding their ground. So there are so many stories within this, and within that is a central moral dilemma, and it creates cognitive dissonance in me. Like I'm glad, I love India, I'm glad that this is what it is, but I think of the start and I do feel that disquiet, and I think of, and I'm sure an American can feel that same disquiet when they think of what they did to the Native Americans and so on. I guess the history of humanity is messy. The past is full of enough events that cause us this kind of dissonance. But this is sort of my story, and within this grander story can be all these little human stories, like VP Menon's journey. Like, what a journey. So, and he wrote a book about, those couple of years as well. But I just find this so fascinating. A 12-year-old boy burns down his school and runs away from the village to work in a mine. Like, what the fuck, right?
I have a speculation that is worth playing in the mind. What if the Republic of India did not take over Goa? Okay, so it's an interesting what if. It becomes an exploration into colonialism and charter cities. Because, in a way, maybe Goa today would have been a part of the European Union. It would have inherited that first world package of institutions. But on the other hand, it would have suffered from colonialism. So it's an interesting tension. Again, playing charter cities. Imagine if there was a bit of a Hong Kong in India. What if the British had kept Surat? Okay, Surat is my favorite example because it's really it could have been the Hong Kong of India. And would it have been different for India if there had been Hong Kong at the doorstep, just as it was for Deng Xiaoping when they started going on their project of economic development? So I find these are interesting alternative histories to play with.
And another sort of counterfactual I have is, what if that Sardarji didn't give the money to VP Menon, the 10 rupees, and therefore Sardar Patel doesn't have this guy by his side, or he falls ill earlier than he did, or everything turns out differently, and we don't have this India. What if we are actually, instead of one India, you have 500 or 50 or 40 or 30 or whatever different entities. And at one level, you can go the negative way and say, hey, that's balkanization and they'll always be fighting each other and it's not a good thing. But at another level, I think about how you and me always say say that government should be as decentralized, as local as possible. And I imagine all of these states living next to each other,
My
too
problem,
weak to really fight, but competing with each other. And therefore, that can become an environment in which good things can happen.
my problem with that is the extent to which in monarchies in India, in those princely states, there was actually phenomenally poor political system development. So the way the British got to the Magna Carta in 1215 and set off on a long journey of dispersion of power and establishing checks and balances and rule of law was generally not the case in India. So I have no
I mean,
hopes for
I'm not
what those princely states would have done.
I'm not making an argument. I'm throwing up a possibility that when we think in
Some of
terms of,
them would have turned into interesting democracies.
yeah, it's when you think in terms of possibilities, and when you also tell yourself that the world is this way because of a series of unique accidents, a perfect storm brought us here.
Yeah.
But it need not have been this way. It could have been a million different things.
Yeah.
So Ajay, tell us your last story of this episode.
Okay, I'm going to tell a story that I am so convinced deserves a movie. And it's a very recent set of events. It's 2022. And as a consequence, actually a great deal of visual imagery is available. And I'm going to request Nomsita and Vaishnav to actually put together the episode where I'm a little more of a soundtrack and there's a great deal of visual storytelling around it. So this is the Battle of Kiev at the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now here's the backdrop. Russia is supposed to be a superpower, right? I mean, they're supposed to be the second most powerful army in the world. And Ukraine, frankly, was supposed to be a bit of a mess. That it was a country that was struggling. There are some measures of institutional capability in Ukraine, which put Ukraine way down in the rankings, right alongside India. Okay, so I have a lot of empathy for Ukraine. I think of it as a messy country that is learning to find their feet like India is. They're not a sophisticated first world country. They're not a mature market economy. They are not an advanced democracy. They don't have good institutions. I mean, Ukraine is like India. So now you think of all the things that go wrong in India and how weak and fragile and malfunctioning the Indian state is. That's our mental model of what Ukraine was like at the start of the war. To spice things up in terms of the human interest, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, had come from a career in television, where he was a comedian on television.
That's what I was thinking, that, the difference is that India did not make Kapil Sharma the president.
Yeah, so this is something like that. And this is the guy who had really been like a lightweight. And you can't make these things up. He had acted in a TV show in which the Russians invade Ukraine and the character that plays the president of Ukraine was Zelensky.
He had also done a comic act where he plays the piano with his dick. Yeah. Which I once told you about. We will also link it from the show notes, but there will be no insert.
This is a family-friendly show.
This is a family-friendly show.
Okay. So Zelensky was the president of Ukraine. And here you had the world's second most powerful army smashing into Ukraine. Okay. Now, what was supposed to happen? So for many people, the idea was that this will be like Afghanistan, where, once the Taliban got going, the leadership just ran away from the city. And this was very much a question for Zelensky, that should you stay in Kiev? That is it better off being a little in the backfield and organizing a resistance? What is worse? Ukraine was thoroughly infiltrated with many people who had been compromised by Russian intelligence. So there were murder squads in in Kiev, with the mandate of killing Zelensky. So in the early days, literally every day, there was one assassination attempt against him. So imagine him and his family, he has small children. Imagine them being told that, it's better for you to leave. And Zelensky says about that period that, I'm not a hero. I'm just a regular guy. There was just no choice, that there was no way to leave and to defend the city and the country. So he said, I understood that if I left, this whole thing would collapse. And basically the Russians would have their way. And he said, in that case, they would kill me anyway. So he says, I'm not a hero. I just had to face that situation and figure out what to do. And I just chose to stay and exposed. You guys all think I'm so great. Actually, I was just a scared, terrified guy standing in the gun sites, making a call every minute, every hour about what to do. In the early hours of the invasion, what has not been widely written about and noticed was actually a spectacular set of cybercrime and electronic warfare successes by the Russian side. So the Russians basically destroyed all government comm systems. So the government was basically blind. People were talking to each other on WhatsApp. So all the formal systems of government had broken down. And there was also a great deal of electronic warfare blinding the defenses on the Ukrainian side. The Russians began with a great blitz of attacks on known Ukrainian sites. Now, on the other hand, in the weeks preceding the invasion, there is a grand and incredibly successful intelligence story. Okay, so this is a spy thriller where basically American intelligence, NATO intelligence had penetrated the Russian side inside out. So there are an amazing amount of as yet unknown heroic stories which took place where the true patriots of Russia leaked all the information about the invasion plans to the Western side, and the NATO intelligence took this all to Zelensky and the others in Ukraine, saying, guys, this is happening, this is coming. And there was a surprising piece of blindness that Zelensky and the others did not believe till the very end that this was coming. They were convinced that this was saber rattling. They were convinced that this is all one big threat to make Ukraine capitulate. And they said, no, hell with you, we're not going to give up. But they didn't believe that an invasion was coming, and they didn't actually prepare completely for an invasion. They did prepare partially for an invasion. The most important element of that being that an important list of assets, of defense assets, were moved away from the places that they were sitting. So at dawn in the early morning, when the first wave of Russian attacks came, the Russian attacks landed on sites which were supposed to contain planes and SAM systems and so on. But those things had all decamped. They'd all been moved off because of the heroism of the individuals inside Putin's system who had given all this information to Western intelligence. And that's where the war started. So there is the river, the Dnieper River, and the Russian idea was to come from both sides, and Kiev is right in the middle. So there was one attack coming from this side and there was one attack coming from this side. And an interesting story is that before the invasion, CIA Director Burns had visited Ukraine, and he had proposed an idea to Ukrainian defense planners that what would happen here is a paratrooper attack on the Kiev airport, which is called Hostomel Airport. Okay, so the CIA director visiting had this idea that, you know what, if I was going to do this, this is the way I would approach this. Now, paratrooper attacks are a very stunning idea, and just let me spend 3 minutes describing them. The most one of the most important paratrooper attacks in world history took place against the island of Crete, I think in 1941, where Crete was an island off the coast of Greece and the Royal Navy was dominant. How is Hitler going to attack this? And the answer is that 6,000 paratroopers came from the air, and they first captured an airfield. Once the airfield was under their command, planes came in carrying heavy equipment. And through that, then they captured the entire island. Okay, so that's a typical World War II type paratrooper attack, that you go behind the lines, you run 10 kilometers, 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers ahead and capture critical assets, create that beachhead where you've got an airport or you've got a landing site, and then by air you deliver heavy equipment there, and it creates confusion. The defending side doesn't know what the hell is going on, and then on the other side you plan a great push for the main forces to reconnect with the bridgehead that has been created on the other side. For example, one of the famous stories during the Second World War that did not work out is the story immortalized by the Cornelius Ryan book, A Bridge Too Far. Okay, the Arnhem Bridges, where in a way a brilliant invasion program was created using paratroopers from the air, and in the end it didn't work out. So all those guys either got killed or got captured because the paratroopers can only hang on for a finite time. Finally, the main forces have to reach there, and the main forces didn't. So this was the idea around Hostomel Airport. So the Russians mounted a great paratrooper attack on the Hostomel Airport. And you know what? It worked. That for a brief period, they actually captured Hostomel Airport. And this was made possible because there was enough suppression of the Ukrainian military communications and electronic countermeasures so that the Ukrainian defenses at the airport had been disrupted, and the Russians actually captured the Hostomel Airport. And then in that chaos and madness, the Ukrainians got a deep breath and understood what was going on and started mounting the greatest underdog, scrappy defense. Okay, and this is just thousands of stories of heroism and innovation and genius. There is a very complex strategic side to this. Zelensky was fighting Western disdain. Okay, so there was always a part of Western Europe, Macron and the French, and a lot of German appeasement of Russia. So their mood for many people was, look, this is another Crimea 2014. So just give Putin a bunch of land and get on with it. Like, we don't want to fight. It's like, I'm too busy. My calendar is full. I can't deal with a crisis. So there was a genuine part of Western Europe which was in no mood to deal with this. And like, hey, in 2014, okay, Barack Obama, who we admire in some ways, basically left the Ukrainians high and dry when Putin grabbed Crimea. So this is one part that Zelensky was dealing with, which is a bunch of people who just didn't care, who were willing to appease Putin. And so, yeah, Putin will grab some more land. You know, he does this every few years. Bad boy. But for the rest, there's nothing to be done. You just let him go. And there was another wing, which was just pessimistic, saying, we recognize that this is a catastrophe, but what are you going to do? You're a comedian. Okay, and you're up against the second greatest military force of the world. So what can you do? So imagine Zelensky in this crisis being up against this kind of disdain and skepticism from the West. So today it is easy to see that to a medium extent, the West has supported Ukraine. They've not supported Ukraine as well as they could have. They've not supported Ukraine as well as they should have, but they have supported Ukraine. In the first few days in the Battle of Kiev, Zelensky was battling for any support because the baseline was zero. They were just doing some trivial bits of training for the so-called JCF, which was fighting in Donbass. They were doing training. They were doing knowledge transfers. That's all. They were not doing anything more than that. And here you had a war on your hands. But some amount of Western help started coming in, most notably the Javelin missiles that Trump had tried to block in the famous, what does Donald Trump call it? The perfect phone call with Zelensky, where he tried to do some corruption before sending those anti-tank missiles to Zelensky, trying to get Zelensky to launch a fake investigation against Biden's son. So some amount of equipment got there, but at that moment, there was very little. It was really a Ukrainian show. It was a Ukrainian story. And they understood what the Russian army was doing. And the Russian side was, corrupt and incompetent, and they made mistakes. And a vastly overpowered, undermanned Ukrainian force put their act together and stopped the Russian advance. And it is story upon story upon story that came together. And there is just all kinds of non-obvious ways in which the underdog has to fight back. So, for example, there was one critical moment where they blew up a bridge to generate a flooding of a critical region from which the Russians were going to mount an attack, and so on. So I see this as a story which is just spectacular, and it satisfies the test. The fate of the world was and is on the line, because the Putin and Russia story is not over as of yet. And it is an underdog story. Okay. It is this comedian and his lovely family standing down assassination attempts, and then it's a bunch of crazy people one by one figuring, strategizing, solving, problem solving, heroism, battles, and ultimately winning. And the Russian side completely withdrew from the Kiev region.
The heroism of ordinary people really strikes me. Like a couple of days back, there was a sad piece of news that the vice president of the Ukraine Chess Federation died. He had gone to fight and he kind of died in that. And even about Zelensky, a story that we've told before on the show is how the Americans offered him to get him out of Ukraine. And he memorably said, "I don't want a ride. I want ammo." Absolutely legendary words, and what a guy. And we've of course done a 5.5 hour seen unseen episode on Ukraine and another episode on Everything is Everything. And the innovation that you detailed out there is mind blowing. For example, they built an Uber for artillery. You see the incentives. You are fighting for survival. So you have to use whatever tricks you have, and where you can't get things done, you figure out ways, you innovate, you get it done. And Uber for artillery, bam, in the middle of a war. Who would have thunk? So it is just an incredible story.
And before we end this episode, Amit Bhai, I have a request for the merchandising division of Amit Bhai Media Private Limited.
Okay, the request is instantly denied, but we do have to recommend things. But what is your request? You want to say it, just get it out of the way.
So the first product was going to be the Katore Bhaji t-shirt.
Indeed.
A second t-shirt should be, "I don't want to ride, I want ammunition."
That's magnificent, but I think this should be, it is really not our place to bring that merchandise out. It is for Ukrainians who love Zelensky to do that, and we shall sort of leave that to them. And now it's time for recommendations.
So Amit, tell us your recommendations for today.
So my recommendation is this book, How Music Works by David Byrne. David Byrne, of course, is the great frontman of the Talking Heads, and this book is a masterpiece. It's the best book I've ever read about music, in the sense that it is incredibly meta. It goes into all the whys, and it also sort of dives into my personal obsession, which is about how form shapes the world, right? And in the context of music, this book just does that brilliantly. And I've been a Talking Heads fan for a long time. And I still remember that magical moment where, thanks to the group of people we spoke about in the last episode called The Reformers, India kind of opened up and we had music television. And I remember one day in the mid-90s switching on music television and watching perhaps a show could have been Rewind, or it could have been 120 Minutes, which was the alternative rock show. I don't remember. But, watching the famous song by the Talking Heads, Once in a Lifetime, right? And if you remember that, you obviously heard it, and getting completely blown away, and then over the years finding out much more about David Byrne and listening to his music. So this book is a masterpiece. Can't recommend it more. Just blindly, even if you don't care about music, just go out and get it.
Not only does he sing, he talks and writes.
Who would have thunk? So, Ajay, what's your recommendation?
My recommendation is a YouTube show called William Spaniel. Okay, so he had some of the best understanding of the Battle of Kiev as it was unfolding.
And that's a great way to sort of end the show on. It's interesting that sometimes you have, the first draft of history. It is often said journalists write the first draft of history, and then later you have sort of more considered accounts of what went on. And it strikes me that in this age, we kind of have to do both. That you have both the first draft of history and the sense making happening simultaneously. And when people like, the channel you described and others like yourself.
So William Spaniel is also writing books. So he has written that more considered, slow understanding, but he's also there in the fray making some really nice videos.
So if he got a dog and it was a spaniel, what would it be called? I'm just wondering. I don't have a punchline for this. But thank you for
tell
listening.
us, gentle reader.
Do tell us in the comments.